The zero came out of the sun at 14,000 feet. Lieutenant William "Billy" Corrigan never saw it. One moment he was flying escort over the Huon Peninsula, scanning the clouds for enemy aircraft. The next moment his P-38 was shuddering, smoke pouring from the left engine, and the jungle canopy was rushing up to meet him. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a beautiful aircraft. Twin engines, twin booms, and enough firepower to tear a Japanese bomber apart in seconds. Corrigan had named his California Girl after the state he missed more than he could say. He had painted a small sun on the nose, one ray for each kill, and the mechanics had joked that he was running out of room. Now California Girl was dying. The left engine was on fire, the right engine was sputtering, and the controls felt like they were connected to nothing at all. Corrigan fought to keep the nose up, fought to gain altitude, fought to give himself time to think. There was no time. The jungle was coming up fast, a solid wall of green that would shatter his aircraft like a toy. He remembered the ejection, the brutal jerk of the parachute opening, hard enough to leave bruises across his shoulders, the long, slow drift through humid air that smelled of rain and rotting vegetation. He remembered hitting the trees, branches tearing at his flight suit, one limb catching him across the face hard enough to draw blood. He remembered the final jarring impact that knocked the wind from his lungs. Then, darkness. It was March 7th, 1943, New Guinea, and Lieutenant William Corrigan was about to begin the longest walk of his life. He woke to the sound of voices. Japanese voices. Corrigan kept his eyes closed, kept his breathing steady, kept every muscle frozen. Through slitted eyelids, he could see boots. Split-toe tabi boots, the kind Japanese soldiers wore. 3 pairs, maybe 4. They were standing over him, talking rapidly in a language he didn't understand. One of them kicked him, not hard, an exploratory kick, testing whether the American pilot was dead or alive. Corrigan didn't react. He let his body absorb the blow, let his head loll to the side, let every fiber of his being project the absolute stillness of a corpse. The voices continued. An argument, maybe. Then footsteps moving away. Then a rifle butt crashed into his ribs. Corrigan gasped. He couldn't help it, and the pretense was over. Hands grabbed him, hauled him upright, slammed him against a tree. A Japanese officer was staring at him, close enough that Corrigan could smell the fish on his breath. The officer said something in Japanese. When Corrigan didn't respond, the officer switched to broken English. "You, pilot, you come." They bound his hands with rope and marched him through the jungle. Corrigan was 26 years old, a former crop duster from Bakersfield, California. He had been flying since he was 16, had joined the Army Air Corps 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and had arrived in New Guinea 3 months ago with the 49th Fighter Group. He had 7 confirmed kills. Enough to make him an ace, enough to earn him a reputation as one of the best pilots in the theater. None of that mattered now. Now he was a prisoner, stumbling through the jungle with his hands tied behind his back, surrounded by enemy soldiers who would kill him without hesitation if he tried to run. But Corrigan wasn't thinking about running. He was thinking about the men in the camp. He had heard rumors. Everyone had heard rumors. Japanese prisoner of war camps scattered through the jungle, holding American and Australian soldiers captured during the disastrous early months of the war. The conditions were said to be brutal. Starvation rations, forced labor, casual brutality that left men broken in body and spirit. Corrigan had always assumed that if he was shot down, he would die, crash into the jungle, burn with his plane, go down fighting. The alternative, capture, had seemed too terrible to contemplate. Now, he was living the alternative. They marched for 3 days. The jungle was relentless. Mud that sucked at their boots with every step, sometimes so deep that it pulled a man down to his knees. Vines that grabbed at their legs like living things. Thorned and thick and impossible to push through. Insects that swarmed around every exposed inch of skin. Mosquitoes and flies and things Corrigan couldn't identify but would remember in nightmares for years. Rain fell every afternoon. Not gentle rain. Sheets of water that turned the trails into rivers and the rivers into torrents. The jungle floor became a swamp. and the soldiers cursed in Japanese as they struggled to keep their footing. Corrigan counted his steps. It was something to do, something to focus on, something that kept him from dwelling on what awaited at the end of the march. He counted to 1,000, then started over. By the end of the first day, he had counted to 1,047 times. 47,000 steps, maybe 20 miles, maybe more. At night, they stopped in small clearings, the soldiers building fires that hissed and sputtered in the damp. Corrigan was given a space at the edge of the camp, his hands still bound, his body aching from the march. He slept in snatches, waking every few hours to the sound of rain or the call of jungle birds or the quiet conversation of his captors. He tried to memorize the route, the rivers they crossed, the ridgelines they climbed, the direction of the sun when it managed to break through the canopy. He was a pilot, navigation was his trade, and some part of him was already thinking about the return journey, if there was a return journey, if he survived long enough to attempt one. The Japanese soldiers were not cruel, not yet. They gave him water when he stumbled, rice balls twice a day, brief rests when the terrain became impassable. They were efficient, professional, focused on delivering their prisoner to the camp intact. Corrigan studied them, learned their patterns, watched where they kept their weapons, how they moved through the jungle, when they relaxed their vigilance. He wasn't planning an escape, not yet, but he was gathering information. The crop duster from Bakersfield had learned long ago that information was the difference between a successful flight and a crash. On the evening of the third day, they reached the camp. It was smaller than Corrigan had expected, a clearing hacked out of the jungle, perhaps 100 yards square, bamboo huts with thatched roofs, a guard tower made of rough-hewn logs, a fence of sharpened stakes that wouldn't stop a determined man but would slow him down enough for the guards to react, and prisoners, maybe 60 of them, gathered in the center of the compound as the new arrival was marched in. Americans and Australians, their faces gaunt, their bodies thin, their eyes carrying the hollow look of men who had given up hope. Corrigan was taken to the commandant's hut, interrogated for 2 hours, beaten when he gave only his name, rank, and serial number, and thrown into a bamboo cage barely large enough to sit upright. He spent 3 days in the cage. They gave him water once a day, no food. The tropical sun turned the cage into an oven by noon, and the night rains left him shivering until dawn. By the end of the third day, he was delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness, unsure what was real and what was fever dream. Then they released him into the general population. The other prisoners received him warily. They had learned that hope was dangerous, that new arrivals often didn't survive their first month, that attachment to a man who might be dead by morning was a luxury they couldn't afford. But one man approached him, an Australian sergeant named Thomas McCready, tall and lean and weathered by 2 years in the jungle. He helped Corrigan to the shade of a hut, gave him water from a precious canteen, and asked the question that would change everything. "You a pilot?" "Yeah." "You know where we are?" Corrigan shook his head. "Somewhere in New Guinea. That's all I know." McCready smiled, a thin, humorless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "We're about 200 miles from the Allied lines, 200 miles of jungle, mountains, and Japanese patrols." He paused. "Think you could navigate it?" "What?" "You're a pilot. You know how to navigate. You know the terrain from the air." McCready leaned closer. "There's 17 of us who want to try. 17 men who'd rather die in the jungle than rot in this camp. We've been waiting for someone who could lead us out." Corrigan stared at him. 200 miles. Through jungle that had nearly killed him in 3 days of marching, with Japanese patrols hunting them every step of the way. "That's suicide," he said. "Probably," McCready agreed, "but staying here is death. Slow, miserable, certain death. At least out there, we've got a chance." Corrigan was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the cage, the beatings, the hollow-eyed men who shuffled through the compound like ghosts. He thought about what another month in this camp would do to him, another year if he lasted that long. He thought about the 17 men who were willing to follow him into the jungle, willing to bet their lives on his ability to find a path through 200 miles of hell. "When do we leave?" he asked. The escape took 3 weeks to plan. They couldn't just walk out of the camp. The guards were alert. The fence was watched, and the jungle beyond was patrolled by Japanese soldiers who knew the terrain far better than any American or Australian prisoner. A frontal escape would be suicide. The guards would cut them down before they made it 20 feet. But the guards had patterns, the patrols had schedules, and the jungle, for all its dangers, offered something that the camp did not: cover. Corrigan spent those 3 weeks observing. He tracked the guard rotations, noting which guards were alert and which were lazy, which watched the fence closely and which spent their shifts half asleep. He identified the gaps in coverage, the moments when a section of the perimeter was unwatched, when a man might slip through without being seen. He talked to prisoners who had been in the camp longest, learning what they knew about the surrounding terrain. Some of them had worked on labor details outside the wire, cutting trees or building roads. They knew the trails that led into the jungle, the streams that might provide drinking water, the directions that led toward friendly lines. One old Australian sergeant, a man named Peters who had been captured at Singapore, drew him a map in the dirt. Rivers and mountains and valleys, sketched from memory, probably inaccurate, but better than nothing. "There's a river runs northeast," Peters said. "Follow it long enough, you'll hit the coast. Coast is where our boys are." "How far?" Peters shrugged. 200 miles, maybe more. Nobody's ever made it. "Somebody's going to," Corrigan said. He also got to know the men who would be following him. There was McCready, the Australian sergeant who had organized the escape, a former jackaroo from Queensland. He had survived 2 years in the camp through sheer stubborn refusal to die. He knew the jungle better than anyone, could find water where there seemed to be none, could identify which plants were edible and which would kill you in hours. There was Private First Class Danny Kowalski, a machine gunner from Chicago who had been captured at Bataan and transferred to New Guinea 6 months ago. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, punishment for a failed escape attempt, but his eyes still burned with defiance. There was Corporal James Whitfield, a medic from Alabama who had kept men alive with nothing but jungle herbs and sheer determination. He carried a medical kit that he had assembled piece by piece, stealing and scavenging over months of captivity. There were 14 others, Americans and Australians, soldiers and airmen, men who had been broken by captivity, and men who had somehow remained whole, all of them willing to die for a chance at freedom. Corrigan felt the weight of their trust like a physical burden. These men were betting their lives on his navigation, his judgment, his ability to lead them through 200 miles of enemy-held jungle. He had never led men before. He was a pilot, a solo operator, a man who lived or died by his own decisions in his own cockpit. Leading 17 men through the jungle was something else entirely. But there was no one else. McCready could survive in the jungle, but he couldn't navigate. Kowalski had the will to fight, but not the knowledge of the terrain. Whitfield could keep them alive if they were wounded, but he couldn't tell them which direction to walk. Only Corrigan had flown over this jungle. Only Corrigan had seen it from above, had memorized the rivers and mountains and valleys that might lead them home. If they were going to escape, he had to lead them. They left on the night of April 3rd, 1943. The moon was dark. Corrigan had insisted on that. They slipped out through a gap in the fence that McCready had identified, a place where the sharpened stakes had rotted enough to be pushed aside. One by one, 17 men crawled through the gap and vanished into the jungle. Corrigan went last. He paused at the edge of the camp, looking back at the huts and the guard tower and the prisoners who remained behind. Men who were too sick to travel. Men who had lost the will to try. Men who would wake tomorrow to find 17 empty bunks and know that somewhere in the jungle, their comrades were either walking toward freedom or dying in the attempt. Then he turned and followed his men into the darkness. The first week was the hardest. They moved at night, navigating by the stars when they could see them, by dead reckoning when the canopy was too thick. Corrigan had studied the constellations from his cockpit, had used them to find his way home on a dozen night missions. Now he used them to find his way through the jungle, orienting himself by the Southern Cross and the stars that wheeled around it. During the day, they hid, in caves that smelled of bat guano and ancient stone, in thickets so dense that sunlight never reached the ground. In the hollows of massive fallen trees, the men curled around each other like animals in a den. They slept in shifts, 2 men always awake, always watching for Japanese patrols. The watches were silent. No talking, no movement, barely any breathing. Just eyes scanning the jungle, ears straining for the sound of approaching soldiers. The jungle itself was almost as dangerous as the Japanese. Snakes coiled in the undergrowth, some of them deadly. Leeches attached themselves to exposed skin, swelling with blood until they dropped off or were burned away. The men developed rashes and sores that Whitfield treated with poultices of leaves, hoping he had identified the right plants, praying he hadn't made a mistake that would kill someone. And the Japanese were hunting them. They had discovered the escape within hours, and now soldiers were combing the jungle, following trails, searching for the 17 men who had slipped through their fingers. Corrigan heard them sometimes, the crack of branches, the murmur of voices. Once, a patrol passed within 20 feet of the thicket where he lay hidden, close enough that he could see the mud on their boots, close enough that he could have reached out and touched the nearest soldier. He held his breath. The men around him held their breath. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity. Then the patrol moved on. They were hungry. The rice they had smuggled out of the camp was gone by the 4th day, and foraging in the jungle was slow, dangerous work. McCready knew which plants were safe, but there weren't enough of them. The men grew weaker, their steps slower, their rest periods longer. On the 6th day, Private Morrison collapsed. He couldn't go on. His legs wouldn't carry him. His body had simply stopped working. He begged them to leave him, to save themselves, to keep moving while they still could. They didn't leave him. Kowalski and another man carried him between them, supporting his weight, refusing to abandon a comrade even when every rational calculation said they should. That was the moment Corrigan understood what kind of men he was leading. These weren't soldiers following orders. These were brothers carrying each other through hell. He pushed on. By the end of the 2nd week, they had covered perhaps 60 miles. It wasn't enough. At this pace, they would run out of strength long before they reached the Allied lines. They needed to move faster, but faster meant more risk, more exposure, more chance of being spotted by Japanese patrols. Corrigan made a decision. "We follow the river," he said. They were huddled in a ravine, 18 men reduced to gaunt shadows by hunger and exhaustion. "It runs northeast toward the coast. The terrain is easier and we can move faster." "The Japanese will be watching the river," McCready said. "It's the obvious route." "I know, but we don't have a choice. If we stay in the deep jungle, we'll die before we reach safety. The river is our only chance." McCready was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You're the navigator. We follow you." They followed the river. McCready was right. The Japanese were watching. They spotted patrols twice in the first 3 days, had to hide in the water once, submerged to their necks with only their faces above the surface, as soldiers walked along the bank not 30 feet away. That moment was the closest they came to discovery. One of the Japanese soldiers had stopped, staring at the river, and Corrigan was certain the man had seen them. He had prepared himself for the end, for the shouts, the gunfire, the final desperate fight that would leave them all dead on the riverbank. But the soldier had only been watching a fish. He had pointed it out to his companions, laughed at something one of them said, and moved on. The river gave them speed. They covered 15 miles on the first day, 20 on the second. The terrain was still brutal. Rapids and waterfalls and stretches where the bank disappeared entirely, and they had to wade through chest-deep water, holding their weapons above their heads to keep them dry. Some of the men couldn't swim. Corrigan hadn't thought about that when he made the decision to follow the river, but McCready had. The Australian fashioned ropes from jungle vines, and the swimmers helped the non-swimmers across the deep sections, a chain of men moving through the water like a living bridge. They lost equipment. One of the captured rifles slipped from a man's grip and disappeared into the murky water. A pack containing what little food they had left was swept away by the current. They mourned the losses, but they kept moving. And something else happened on the river. They found food. Fish. The river was full of them. Small silverfish that could be caught with bare hands if you were patient enough. McCready showed them how, standing motionless in the shallows, hands beneath the surface, waiting for a fish to swim close enough to grab. It took patience and practice, and the first few attempts ended in failure, but soon the men were catching enough to eat, filling their bellies for the first time since the escape. They cooked the fish when they could, ate them raw when they couldn't. The taste was terrible, muddy and foul, and nothing like the fish Corrigan remembered from California, but it was food, and food meant life. The men grew stronger. Not strong, never strong, but stronger. The hollow look in their eyes began to fade, replaced by something that might have been hope. Corrigan felt it too. The weight of responsibility was still there, crushing and constant, but now there was something else beneath it. The possibility, however remote, that they might actually make it. 70 miles, 80, 90. The jungle began to change. The trails showed signs of use. Not Japanese use, but different. Boot prints that matched Allied patterns. Discarded ration tins with English labels. Once they found a scrap of newspaper, months old and rain-damaged, but unmistakably from an Australian publication. They were getting close. On the 22nd day, they reached a river crossing that Corrigan recognized. He had flown over it a dozen times, had used it as a navigation checkpoint on missions to the coast. The Allied lines were less than 20 miles away. That night, they moved faster than they had since the escape. Caution gave way to desperation. The desperate need to finish this journey, to reach safety, to finally stop running. Corrigan had to hold them back, had to remind them that the Japanese were still out there, that capture now would mean death. "We've come too far to die in the last 20 miles, he said. "We move carefully, we move quietly, and we all get home." They listened, they slowed down, but the excitement was there, electric in the air, impossible to suppress. They crossed into Allied-controlled territory on April 29, 1943. They didn't know it at first. The jungle looked the same towering trees, the same choking undergrowth, the same endless green. But then they heard something that made them freeze. Voices, speaking English, Australian English, with that distinctive accent that sounded like music to men who had been listening to Japanese for weeks. Corrigan signaled the men to halt. They crouched in the brush, weapons ready. They had captured 2 Japanese rifles during the escape, and Kowalski had fashioned a spear from a bamboo pole. After all they had been through, they weren't taking any chances. The voices grew closer. Then a patrol emerged from the trees. Australian soldiers, their uniforms mud-stained and sweat-soaked, their faces suspicious as they scanned the jungle. They were young, most of them, but they moved like veterans, their weapons ready, their eyes never still. Corrigan stood up. He raised his hands, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender, though surrender was the last thing on his mind. "Don't shoot," he said. His voice cracked from disuse, from exhaustion, from the sheer overwhelming emotion of the moment. "We're Americans. We escaped from a Japanese camp." For a moment, nothing happened. The Australians stared at him, at the ragged men emerging from the brush behind him, at the hollow-eyed ghosts who had walked 200 miles through hell to reach this moment. Then the patrol leader lowered his rifle. "Jesus Christ," he said. "How many of you are there?" 17, Corrigan said. "All 17. He didn't realize he was crying until McCready put a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," the Australian said. "You got us home." Corrigan looked at the men around him, gaunt, exhausted, barely alive, but alive. Every single one of them. 200 miles through enemy jungle, and he hadn't lost a man. "We did it," he said. "All of us." The Army Air Corps tried to give Corrigan a medal. He refused it, told them to give it to McCready, who had kept them alive in the jungle, told them to give it to Kowalski, who had carried Morrison for 3 days on a shattered body, told them to give it to Whitfield, who had treated wounds and fevers and dysentery with nothing but jungle plants and determination. They gave him the medal anyway, the Distinguished Service Cross, pinned to his chest by a general who called him a hero. Corrigan didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done what needed to be done. Nothing more, nothing less. He went back to flying. The doctors said he was too weak, too malnourished, too damaged by his ordeal to return to combat. He had lost 30 pounds in the jungle. His muscles had wasted, and his body showed the signs of malaria and dysentery and a dozen other ailments he had contracted during the walk. But Corrigan told them he'd been flying since he was 16, and he wasn't about to stop now. It took 3 months of recuperation before the doctors cleared him. 3 months of eating regular meals, of sleeping in a real bed, of slowly rebuilding the body that the jungle had nearly destroyed. He spent the time at a hospital in Brisbane, surrounded by other wounded men, other survivors, other ghosts from the Pacific War. The other patients knew his story. Word had spread through the hospital, through the Army Air Corps, through the entire Pacific Theater. The pilot who had walked 200 miles. The officer who had led 17 men through enemy jungle without losing a single one. They asked him about it sometimes. What was it like? How did you survive? How did you keep going when the jungle seemed endless and the Japanese seemed everywhere? Corrigan never knew how to answer. How could he explain the weight of 17 lives on his shoulders? How could he describe the moments when he had been certain they were all going to die, when the only thing that kept him moving was the knowledge that stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant betraying the men who trusted him? He couldn't explain it, so he just shrugged and changed the subject. When the doctors finally cleared him, he returned to his unit. The 49th Fighter Group had moved on without him. New bases, new missions, new pilots to replace the ones who had been lost. But they welcomed him back like a hero, threw a party that lasted until dawn, and assigned him a brand new P-38 that he named California Girl 2. He flew 37 more missions before the war ended, shot down 2 more Japanese planes, earned another Distinguished Flying Cross, to go with the one he had received before his capture. Never talked about the walk unless someone asked. And even then, he kept the details brief. "We walked out," he would say. "That's all. We just walked out." But the men who walked with him knew better. They knew about the nights when Corrigan had stayed awake, navigating by stars he could barely see through the canopy. They knew about the moments when he had made decisions that meant life or death, which route to take, when to move, when to hide. They knew about the weight he had carried, the responsibility for 17 lives that had rested entirely on his shoulders. They knew, and they remembered. After the war, Corrigan went home to Bakersfield. He married his high school sweetheart, a girl named Eleanor who had waited 4 years for him to come home. She had written him every week, letters that he received in bunches whenever mail caught up with his unit, letters that he had read and reread until the paper was soft and the ink was faded. He had never told her about the camp, never told her about the walk. She knew something had happened. The army had notified her that he was missing, then notified her again when he was found. But she had never pressed for details, and he had never offered them. Some things were better left in the jungle. They bought a small ranch outside Bakersfield, a few hundred acres of dry California land that reminded Corrigan of the terrain he had flown over before the war. He went back to crop dusting, flying low over the fields the way he had as a teenager, feeling the familiar joy of being in the air. They had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, all of them with Eleanor's dark hair and Corrigan's blue eyes. The boys learned to fly before they learned to drive, taking the controls of the family's Piper Cub under their father's watchful eye. Corrigan taught every single one of them, children and grandchildren alike, the same lessons his father had taught him: how to read the wind, how to trust your instruments, how to stay calm when everything was going wrong. And he taught them something else too, something he never put into words but demonstrated every day of his life. Never give up, never stop moving, never accept that the odds are too long or the distance is too great. His grandchildren didn't understand where the lesson came from. They didn't know about the jungle, about the camp, about the 200 miles of enemy territory. They just knew that their grandfather was a man who finished what he started, who never quit, who always found a way. He never went back to New Guinea, never wanted to see that jungle again, never wanted to smell the rot and the rain and the fear, but he kept in touch with the men who had walked with him. Christmas cards and phone calls and occasional reunions where aging veterans gathered to remember the journey that had brought them home. McCready visited once, in 1978. The Australian was old by then, weathered by decades of sun and hard work, but his eyes were the same, sharp, knowing, carrying memories that would never fade. They sat on Corrigan's porch, drinking beer and watching the California sunset. "I never thanked you properly," McCready said, "for what you did. You thanked me enough. You all did." "No." McCready shook his head. "You don't understand. When you showed up at that camp, we had given up. Every single one of us. We were just waiting to die." He paused. "You gave us something to live for. A chance. That's worth more than any thank you." Corrigan was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the jungle, the river, the endless miles of green hell, He thought about the men who had followed him, the trust they had placed in him, the weight of 17 lives that he had carried through 200 miles of enemy territory. "I was just the navigator," he said finally. "You all walked the same miles I did, but you knew which way to walk. That made all the difference." Corrigan couldn't argue with that, so he just raised his beer and clinked it against Macready's. "To the walk," he said. "To the walk," Macready agreed, "and to the man who led the way." William Corrigan died in 2001 at the age of 84. He was buried in Bakersfield with full military honors, his Distinguished Service Cross placed in his hands before the casket was closed. 17 men attended the funeral, old men now, bent by age, their hair white and their steps slow. But they had come from across the country, from Chicago and Alabama and Queensland, to say goodbye to the man who had walked them home. They stood at his graveside and remembered the jungle, the river, the nights when death seemed certain and hope seemed impossible, the moment when they had emerged from the trees and heard English voices and known, finally, that they were safe. Macready spoke the eulogy. His voice was strong despite his years, carrying across the cemetery with the same certainty that had sustained them through 200 miles of hell. Billy Corrigan was not a man who sought glory, he said. He was a man who did what needed to be done. When we needed a leader, he led. When we needed a navigator, he navigated. When we needed someone to carry the weight of our lives, he carried it without complaint. He paused, looking at the flag-draped casket. "He always said he just walked the same miles we did. That wasn't true. He walked every mile twice, once for himself and once for us. He carried us through that jungle as surely as if we had been on his back." Macready's voice broke slightly. He steadied himself and continued, "I've lived a long life, seen a lot of men, served with some of the best soldiers Australia ever produced, but I never met a man like Billy Corrigan, a man who could look at 200 miles of impossible terrain and say, 'Follow me, I'll get you home.'" He saluted the casket. "Rest easy, mate. You've earned it." The other survivors saluted as well, 16 old men, standing at attention, honoring the 17th who had led them home. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, there is a small exhibit dedicated to the prisoner escapes of World War II. Most of the escapes were failures, men caught and executed, men who died in the jungle, men who simply disappeared into the green hell and were never seen again. The statistics are sobering. Of the thousands of Allied prisoners held in Japanese camps throughout the Pacific, only a handful ever escaped. The jungle was too dense, the distances too great, the Japanese too vigilant. Men who tried to run usually died, from starvation, from disease, from bullets in the back. But there is one story of success. A pilot, 17 men, 200 miles of Japanese-held jungle. The exhibit doesn't have much. A faded photograph showing Corrigan and his men shortly after their rescue, their faces gaunt but their eyes alive with triumph. A hand-drawn map, reconstructed from Corrigan's memory, showing the route they had taken through the jungle. A few personal effects donated by the survivors. A compass that had guided them. A canteen that had held the water they drank. A Japanese rifle that Kowalski had captured during a brief skirmish on the 10th day. There is also a letter, written by Macready in 1980, describing what the walk had meant to him. "We were dead men," the letter reads. "Every one of us. We had accepted it, made peace with it, prepared ourselves for the end. Then Billy Corrigan showed up, and suddenly there was hope. He gave us that. He gave us a chance to live, and when the chance came, he led us through 200 miles of hell without losing a single man. That's not leadership. That's something else. That's grace." The exhibit doesn't attract many visitors. It's in a back corner, easy to miss, overshadowed by the larger displays about famous battles and famous generals. But occasionally someone stops, reads the placard, studies the photograph of 18 exhausted men who had walked out of the jungle, and perhaps for just a moment they understand what it meant. The weight of 17 lives, the endless miles of green, the determination to keep walking when every rational calculation said the journey was impossible. Those numbers don't capture the hunger or the fear or the endless nights of uncertainty. They don't capture the moments when surrender seemed like the only option, when the jungle seemed infinite, when death seemed preferable to another day of walking. They don't capture what it meant to follow a man into the unknown, trusting that he would find the way. But the numbers tell the essential truth. they escaped, they survived, they made it home. Because one pilot knew the way, because one man was willing to lead, because 17 men refused to give up, refused to die in a Japanese camp, refused to accept that the jungle was impassable and the distance was too great and the odds were too long. They walked 200 miles through hell, and every single one of them came home. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. These stories of courage and survival deserve to be remembered and shared. Drop a comment below. Could you have made that walk? 200 miles through enemy jungle with 17 lives depending on your navigation. And if you haven't already, check out our previous video on the New Guinea campaign, the larger context for this incredible story of one pilot's determination to bring his men home. Until next time.